Mary Ford was 35 years old and living a life built entirely around survival. She worked as an emergency room nurse in a busy city hospital, often moving from night shifts straight into morning coverage without rest. On her worst weeks, she picked up extra agency shifts and still taught a CNA class just to stay ahead of rent. That morning, she sat in her old car outside the hospital, eating cold noodles from a plastic container balanced on her lap. Her fuel gauge was nearly empty, and she was quietly calculating whether she could stretch enough gas money to survive the week. "I can skip coffee again," she whispered to herself. Inside the hospital, she had just finished running a critical emergency case where a patient collapsed in aisle 6 of a grocery store. Her hands stayed steady the entire time, even when monitors screamed. That was her strength, control under pressure, but her own life felt like chaos she could not fix. Welcome back. Please do not forget to like and hit the subscribe button. That evening, Mary Ford received a message from her mother, Mabel Ford. It simply read, "Sunday dinner. Grandpa is coming." The message made her pause longer than expected. Her grandfather, William Coltrane, was the only person in the family who treated her with warmth and respect. Still, something about the timing unsettled her. Sunday dinner was held at Mabel Ford's house, the same house her late father had built before his death. Mary Ford arrived straight from a shift, still in scrubs, her hair loosely tied and exhaustion written across her face. Inside, her sister Elizabeth Ford was already there, dressed sharply and speaking loudly about her recent luxury trip, while her husband Paul bragged about investments. Mabel Ford immediately noticed Mary Ford and sighed. "You always come like this," she said sharply. Mary Ford didn't argue. She simply washed her hands and sat down, already feeling like an outsider in her own family. The front door opened, and William Coltrane walked in with steady, quiet strength. At 80 years old, he still carried himself like a man who had worked his entire life for everything he owned. The moment he saw Mary Ford, his face softened. "There's my girl," he said, pulling her into a warm hug. For a brief moment, Mary Ford felt something she rarely felt at home: peace. William Coltrane held her shoulders as he stepped back. "You look tired, but you're doing good," he said gently. Around the table, conversation resumed. Elizabeth Ford talked about expensive clients, while Paul discussed money in a way that felt effortless. Mabel Ford controlled the flow of conversation, carefully avoiding anything uncomfortable. During dinner, William Coltrane suddenly looked at Mary Ford and asked casually, "How's that check treating you, sweetheart?" The question sounded harmless, but the room shifted instantly. Mary Ford frowned. "What check?" she asked. Mabel Ford quickly laughed it off. "She's fine, Dad. Don't confuse her with money talk." But the tension didn't leave the room. The next morning, Mary Ford found an official envelope waiting at her apartment. It was from an accounting firm she did not recognize. She opened it while still half awake from her night shift. As she read, she slowly sat down on the floor. The letter stated that financial gifts had been sent in her name for years by William Coltrane. The amounts were far higher than anything she had ever earned. "This has to be wrong," she whispered. But the document was clear. She immediately checked her bank accounts. There were no deposits matching the amounts listed. Nothing. No trace at all. That night, she called Mabel Ford. "Mom, has Grandpa ever sent money to me through you?" she asked carefully. There was a pause. Too long. Then Mabel Ford replied coldly, "You're overthinking things, Mary Ford. You're exhausted. Go to sleep." The dismissal felt rehearsed. And for the first time, Mary Ford stopped trusting the explanations she had always accepted. Over the following days, Mary Ford began quietly observing everything around her. She stopped asking direct questions. Instead, she watched patterns. She noticed how Mabel Ford always redirected conversations when money came up. She noticed how Elizabeth Ford avoided eye contact whenever finances were mentioned. Even Paul seemed too comfortable when expensive topics were discussed. One evening, while helping Mabel Ford in the spare room, Mary Ford made a decision. When her mother stepped out, she opened a laptop on the desk. It was already logged into a bank account. What she saw made her breath tighten. Monthly deposits matched exactly what the letter described, thousands arriving consistently. But every deposit was quickly transferred out to an account linked to Elizabeth Ford and Paul. Mary Ford took photos silently, her hands steady despite the shock building inside her. When Elizabeth Ford suddenly entered the room, she froze. "What are you doing on that computer?" she asked sharply. Mary Ford closed the laptop calmly and said, "Helping Mom." But inside, she already understood. This was not confusion. It was a pattern. After what she saw, Mary Ford could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bank records repeating in her mind. At work, she moved through her shift like a machine, but her thoughts were elsewhere. That afternoon, she called a legal aid clinic after a coworker suggested it. The lawyer, a calm woman named Dana, listened carefully as Mary Ford explained everything: her grandfather Williams Coltrane, her mother Mabel Ford, and her sister Elizabeth Ford with her husband Paul. Dana stayed quiet for a long moment before speaking. "If what you're saying is correct, this isn't just family money confusion," she said. "It could be financial fraud." Mary Ford froze. "Fraud?" she repeated. Dana nodded. "And the only way to prove it is through official bank endorsement records." That word, proof, hit her harder than anything else. Because for the first time, she understood she didn't just need answers. She needed evidence no one could deny. A few days later, Mary Ford was called back to Mabel Ford's house. Her mother's voice on the phone was unusually sweet. "We're organizing something special for your grandfather," she said. "A big birthday dinner. I want you to help with arrangements." When Mary Ford arrived, she saw Elizabeth Ford already planning decorations and catering with excitement, while Paul discussed venue costs like money had no meaning. Mabel Ford turned to her and smiled tightly. "You'll handle the flowers. You're good at small details." Mary Ford studied her mother's face carefully. There was something forced in her calmness. Something defensive. "Of course," Mary Ford replied quietly. But inside, she was already thinking differently. This wasn't just a celebration. It was an opportunity. Everyone who mattered would be in one place, including Williams Coltrane. And for the first time, she saw the dinner not as a family event, but as a battlefield. That same night, Mary Ford met with Dana again and explained the upcoming dinner. Dana leaned back, thinking carefully. "If your grandfather Williams Coltrane is present and willing to request bank records himself, we can unlock everything," she said. "But it has to be done carefully. No accusations without proof in front of witnesses." Mary Ford nodded slowly. "I don't want drama," she said. "I just want truth," Dana replied. "Then you need to control the moment." Later at home, Mary Ford prepared a small folder. Inside were copies of the bank letter, screenshots, and notes she had collected. She arranged everything like she would in a medical file: clean, organized, undeniable. She kept repeating one thing to herself: stay calm. Let the records speak. Meanwhile, she noticed how Mabel Ford kept calling her more often than usual, asking about decorations and timing, as if making sure she stayed involved. It felt less like planning and more like monitoring. 2 days before the dinner, Mary Ford decided to visit Williams Coltrane alone. She found him sitting in his garden, reading quietly. When he saw her, he smiled immediately. "You've been distant lately," he said gently. Mary Ford sat beside him, nervous but steady. "Grandpa," she began carefully, "have you ever looked closely at your bank statements?" He frowned slightly. "Your mother handles most of that," he replied. That answer confirmed everything she feared. Mary Ford took a breath. "I think something is wrong," she said softly. Williams Coltrane looked at her for a long moment. "If something is wrong, I want to know," he said firmly. That was all she needed. She didn't accuse anyone. She didn't explain everything. She simply said, "At the dinner, I need you to ask one question. Ask how your checks have been handled." He nodded slowly. "Then I will ask it," he said. The day of the dinner arrived, and the house was filled with movement and noise. Elizabeth Ford supervised decorations with pride, while Paul checked expensive catering arrangements. Mabel Ford moved through the house like everything belonged to her control. But Mary Ford stayed quiet, observing everything carefully. She placed her folder inside her bag and kept it close. Every detail felt sharper now, the laughter, the forced smiles, the nervous energy beneath the surface. When Williams Coltrane arrived, the room brightened instantly. Everyone greeted him warmly, but Mary Ford noticed how quickly Mabel Ford positioned herself beside him, guiding him gently through conversation. It was subtle, but familiar. She had seen this pattern before: redirect, distract, control. As guests filled the room, Mary Ford took a slow breath. This was the moment everything had been leading to. In a few hours, the truth would either be buried again, or finally exposed in front of everyone. As guests continued arriving, Mary Ford moved through the house carefully, greeting people with a calm face while studying every interaction. Elizabeth Ford was already in full performance mode, laughing loudly and showing off details of the expensive event, while Paul moved between guests like a man trying to appear important. Mabel Ford stayed close to Williams Coltrane, gently steering him into conversations before he could drift too far toward Mary Ford. It was subtle, almost invisible, but Mary Ford noticed everything now. When she offered to help in the kitchen, her mother quickly assigned her small tasks that kept her away from the main room. "Just stay busy with the flowers," Mabel Ford said firmly. Mary Ford nodded, but inside she was no longer obedient. She was observant. Every action felt like another piece of a pattern she was finally beginning to fully understand. Near the start of dinner, Williams Coltrane tapped his glass lightly, signaling for attention. The room quieted immediately. "Before we celebrate," he said warmly, "I want to say something to my granddaughter, Mary Ford." A soft smile moved across the room as everyone turned toward her. Mabel Ford smiled too, but it didn't reach her eyes. Mary Ford felt every heartbeat slow. Her grandfather continued, "I've always helped my family in my own way, and I've been sending support for years. I just want to make sure it's being received properly." The room chuckled lightly, thinking it was a sentimental toast. But Mary Ford saw how Mabel Ford stiffened slightly in her seat. Elizabeth Ford glanced at Paul, who suddenly became very interested in his glass. Something unspoken passed between them, quick and tense. Williams Coltrane turned toward Mary Ford and asked gently, "How has the support been treating you, sweetheart?" The question landed softly, but the room seemed to hold its breath. Mabel Ford immediately stepped in, laughing too loudly. "Oh, Dad, she's fine. She's busy, you know how she is." But Mary Ford didn't respond right away. Instead, she slowly placed her napkin on the table. Her calm was different now, no longer passive, but intentional. "Actually," she said quietly, her voice steady, "that's something I've been wanting to talk about." The room shifted instantly. Elizabeth Ford straightened in her chair. Paul stopped moving completely. Mabel Ford turned her head slowly toward her daughter, eyes narrowing slightly. For the first time that evening, Mary Ford had the attention of everyone in the room without being interrupted. From her bag, Mary Ford removed a small folder and placed it on the table. The sound was soft, but it felt heavy in the silence. "Grandpa Williams Coltrane," she said carefully, "you've been sending me financial support for years. But I need you to look at something." She opened the folder and slid copies of documents across the table: bank letters, transaction summaries, and records she had gathered. Murmurs spread instantly among the guests. Mabel Ford stood halfway. "Mary, stop this," she said sharply. But Mary Ford didn't look at her. She kept her focus on her grandfather. "I never received this money," she said calmly. "Not a single dollar." The room went still again. Elizabeth Ford's face went pale. Paul leaned back slowly in his chair as if the air had become heavier. Williams Coltrane picked up one of the documents and studied it carefully. His expression changed slowly, from confusion to disbelief. "This is my signature," he said quietly, pointing at a check. Then he turned it over. The back of the document showed a signature that was supposed to be Mary Ford's name, but it was not her handwriting. His eyes narrowed. "This isn't hers," he said firmly. The words hit the room like a shock wave. Mabel Ford immediately moved forward. "Dad, this is being misunderstood," she said quickly. But Williams Coltrane did not look at her. He kept staring at the document. Mary Ford remained seated, her voice steady. "It's not a misunderstanding," she said softly. "It's a pattern." The silence that followed was deep and heavy, and for the first time, no one at the table knew what to say next. A heavy silence settled over the room after Mary Ford spoke. No one moved at first, not even Elizabeth Ford, who still stood halfway from her chair, frozen between denial and panic. Williams Coltrane slowly placed the document back on the table, his hand steady but his eyes sharper than before. "Explain this," he said quietly, his voice no longer warm. Mabel Ford immediately stepped forward, forcing a smile. "Dad, this is being blown out of proportion," she said. "Mary is tired, she's confused." But Mary Ford didn't react. She simply opened another page in the folder and placed it down. "I've checked my bank records," she said calmly. "There is no trace of any money ever entering my account." Her voice was steady, controlled. That calmness did more damage than shouting ever could. Elizabeth Ford suddenly laughed, but it sounded sharp and nervous. "So what are you saying?" she snapped. "That we stole from you?" Paul shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Mary Ford finally turned toward her sister. "I'm saying the money went somewhere," she said quietly, "and it didn't come to me." She slid another document across the table, this one showing repeated transfers into accounts linked to Elizabeth Ford and Paul. A few guests leaned forward, confused but alarmed. Williams Coltrane picked up the page slowly, scanning it word by word. His jaw tightened. "These accounts," he said slowly, "they are not hers." The realization in his voice changed the air completely. Mabel Ford stepped forward again, her tone rising. "Dad, you don't understand financial systems. This could be anything." But Williams Coltrane raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I understand enough," he said firmly. The room fell silent again. He turned his eyes toward Mary Ford, softer now but deeply hurt. "You never received anything?" he asked. Mary Ford shook her head once. "Not a dollar," she said. That answer hung in the air like something breaking slowly. Elizabeth Ford suddenly pushed her chair back. "This is insane," she said loudly. "You're trying to turn him against us." But her voice cracked slightly at the end. Paul finally spoke, quietly but defensively. "We didn't do anything illegal," he said. "We just managed family funds." The word managed made Mary Ford look at him directly for the first time. "You mean you took it," she said calmly, "and redirected it." The tension escalated as voices began overlapping. Guests whispered among themselves, unsure who to believe. Mabel Ford moved closer to Williams Coltrane, touching his arm gently. "Dad, please, this is embarrassing," she said softly. But he pulled his arm slightly away. That small movement said more than words. Williams Coltrane looked around the table, then back at the documents. "I have been sending support for years," he said slowly. "And I was told it was being received." His eyes darkened as he turned toward Mabel Ford. "By you." The word landed heavily. Mabel Ford opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. Mary Ford stayed silent, letting the moment unfold. She didn't need to speak now. The evidence was speaking for her. Elizabeth Ford suddenly grabbed her glass. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply, her voice rising again. "You're destroying this family over paperwork." But Williams Coltrane stood up fully now, his presence commanding the room in a way it hadn't been all evening. "Paperwork," he repeated slowly. "This is my signature, my money, my granddaughter's name." He looked directly at Mary Ford again. "And you're telling me none of it reached you?" Mary Ford met his eyes. "No, Grandpa," she said quietly. "It didn't." That final confirmation changed everything. The room no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like an exposure. And as Mabel Ford, Elizabeth Ford, and Paul sat in silence, it became clear that whatever came next would no longer be controlled by them. The room stayed frozen as Williams Coltrane slowly lowered himself back into his chair, but his expression had changed completely. The warmth was gone, replaced by something firm and unmovable. "I want answers," he said quietly. His eyes moved from Mabel Ford to Elizabeth Ford, then finally to Paul. "All of you." Mabel Ford immediately tried to speak. "Dad, please, let's not do this in front of everyone." But he interrupted her. "No," he said sharply. "We will do this here. Now." That single word, "now," silenced the entire table again. Mary Ford remained still, watching carefully. She had expected confrontation, but not this level of clarity from her grandfather. For the first time, she saw him not as a victim, but as a man fully awake to what was happening. Elizabeth Ford suddenly stood again, pushing her chair back hard. "This is humiliating," she said loudly. "You're accusing us over some papers and assumptions." But Williams Coltrane held up the documents again. "These are not assumptions," he said calmly. "These are records." His voice dropped slightly, heavier now. "And they show money leaving my accounts and never reaching my granddaughter." Paul shifted uncomfortably. "We can explain," he started, but Williams Coltrane cut him off with a look. "Then explain why her name is forged on endorsements she never signed." That question hung in the air without mercy. Mary Ford watched her sister closely now, noticing the cracks forming in her confidence. The performance was weakening. A murmur spread through the guests as they realized this was no longer a family disagreement. It was something deeper. Mabel Ford stepped closer to Williams Coltrane, her voice lowering into pleading. "Dad, you don't want to ruin this family over misunderstandings," she said softly. But he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her for a long time. "I already asked for truth," he said quietly. "You gave me comfort instead." That sentence landed harder than shouting. Mary Ford felt her chest tighten. For years, she had believed silence kept peace. Now she was seeing how silence protected lies instead. Elizabeth Ford suddenly pointed toward Mary Ford. "She's doing this for attention," she said quickly. "She's always been jealous. Always struggling." The words were sharp, but they sounded desperate now. Mary Ford didn't react immediately. She simply looked at her sister. "I didn't come here for attention," she said calmly. "I came for truth." She then turned slightly toward the guests. "And I didn't forge my own name. Someone else did." That statement shifted the entire room again. Even those who had been whispering fell silent. Paul looked down at the table, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Williams Coltrane slowly placed both hands on the table, steadying himself as he processed everything. His voice was lower now, but clear. "I will not continue this dinner until I know exactly where every dollar went," he said firmly. Then he turned to Mabel Ford. "And I want the truth from you." The room held its breath. Mabel Ford opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. For the first time, her control was slipping. Mary Ford watched quietly, knowing the next moments would determine everything. The celebration was over now. What remained was exposure, and there was no turning back. The pressure in the room became unbearable as Mabel Ford finally spoke, her voice trembling for the first time. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said quietly. Everyone turned toward her instantly. Williams Coltrane didn't interrupt this time, he only watched. Mary Ford stayed still, her hands folded, waiting. Mabel Ford continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Your money was never meant to disappear. It was redirected to keep everything afloat." That word, redirected, made Elizabeth Ford shift uncomfortably in her seat. Paul looked down, rubbing his forehead. Williams Coltrane leaned forward. "Keep what afloat?" he asked sharply. The softness in his voice was gone completely now. Mabel Ford hesitated, and that hesitation said more than words. Elizabeth Ford suddenly tried to interrupt. "Mom, don't," she started, but Mabel Ford raised a hand to stop her. Silence fell again. Mabel Ford looked at Mary Ford, then at Williams Coltrane. "The house," she admitted quietly. "The bills. The debts. Everything was falling apart." A collective shift moved through the table. Mary Ford didn't react outwardly, But she felt it, the confirmation she had already suspected. Williams Coltrane's face tightened. "So you took from her," he said slowly, turning toward Mary Ford, "to save yourselves." The sentence wasn't a question. It was a conclusion. Paul finally spoke, voice low. "We didn't think it would hurt anyone," he said. That made a few guests whisper in disbelief. Mary Ford finally leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "It did hurt someone," she said. "Me." The room went silent again. She continued, steady now. "I worked 3 jobs. I skipped meals. I counted gas money. And I was told I was just struggling." Her eyes moved from Mabel Ford to Elizabeth Ford. "Meanwhile, money meant for me was used to fund everything else." Elizabeth Ford shook her head quickly. "You act like you were entitled to it," she snapped. But Mary Ford didn't raise her voice. "I didn't know it existed," she said simply. That one sentence shifted the emotional weight in the room again. Williams Coltrane stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Enough excuses," he said firmly. His voice carried across the room like a final warning. He looked directly at Mabel Ford. "You told me she was receiving everything." His voice broke slightly at the end, not from weakness, but betrayal. Mabel Ford couldn't meet his eyes anymore. Elizabeth Ford suddenly grabbed her purse, as if preparing to leave, but stopped when she saw everyone looking at her. Paul remained seated, silent and pale. The guests no longer looked like attendees at a dinner, they looked like witnesses. Mary Ford slowly opened her folder again and placed one final document on the table. "There's more," she said quietly. Everyone turned toward her. She slid forward printed bank summaries showing repeated transfers, matching timelines, and forged endorsements. "It wasn't a one-time mistake," she said. "It was consistent." She looked at Williams Coltrane. 4 years. The word landed heavily. Williams Coltrane stared at the pages, his hands tightening. Then he looked up at Mabel Ford, his voice barely controlled. "You built a system," he said. Mabel Ford didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth was now fully exposed, and the room understood that the dinner had officially ended in something far more permanent than silence. The room remained locked in a tense silence after Mary Ford placed the final documents on the table. Williams Coltrane slowly sat back down, but his hands were clenched tightly now. His voice, when it came, was low and controlled. "I want every transaction reversed," he said, looking directly at Mabel Ford. "Every dollar taken under my name." Mabel Ford finally looked up, her face pale and exhausted. "Dad, I was trying to protect the family," she said weakly. But Williams Coltrane shook his head. "No," he replied. "You were protecting a lie." Across the table, Elizabeth Ford suddenly pushed her chair back again, but this time no one reacted. The energy in the room had shifted completely. There was no more performance left. Paul finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "We can work something out privately," he said carefully. But Mary Ford shook her head. "It was private for 4 years," she replied. "That's why it continued." Her words cut through the room cleanly. Williams Coltrane looked at her, and for the first time that night, there was something like pride mixed with pain in his expression. "You handled this better than I did," he said softly. Mary Ford didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him and said, "I just stopped ignoring it." That simple truth landed harder than any accusation. Mabel Ford finally broke completely, lowering herself into a chair as if her strength had drained out of her. "We were drowning," she said quietly. "Bills, pressure, everything was collapsing after your father died." She looked at Mary Ford, her voice trembling. "We didn't know how to survive." Mary Ford listened without interrupting. Then she replied, steady but firm, "So you chose my survival to sacrifice instead." The words made Mabel Ford flinch. Elizabeth Ford tried to speak again, but stopped when she saw Williams Coltrane raise his hand slightly. The older man exhaled slowly, as if carrying the weight of everything at once. "I trusted you," Williams Coltrane said to Mabel Ford. "I trusted all of you." His voice cracked slightly, but he did not sit down. He looked around the table, then at Mary Ford again. "And I ignored what I should have questioned." A heavy silence followed. No one interrupted him now. Even Elizabeth Ford remained still. The guests at the table sat frozen, understanding they were witnessing something that could not be undone. Finally, Mary Ford closed her folder gently. "This is no longer about explanation," she said. "It's about correction." She looked at Mabel Ford, then Elizabeth Ford, then Paul. "The records are already with the authorities." That statement changed the air instantly. Elizabeth Ford looked up sharply. "You reported this?" she asked in disbelief. Mary Ford nodded once. "I documented everything," she said calmly. Williams Coltrane did not react with anger, only acceptance. The room understood then that the turning point had already passed. What remained was consequence, not negotiation. A wave of panic moved through Elizabeth Ford as she grabbed her phone under the table, but Williams Coltrane noticed immediately. "Put it down," he said sharply. She froze, then slowly placed it back. Paul leaned back in his chair, realizing there was nowhere left to hide behind words. Mary Ford remained still, watching the unraveling with quiet control. The room no longer felt like a family gathering. It felt like a courtroom where judgment had already begun. Mabel Ford whispered weakly, "We didn't think it would go this far." But no one responded to that anymore. The explanation had lost its meaning. Williams Coltrane slowly turned toward Mary Ford, his voice softening. "What happens now?" he asked. It wasn't fear in his tone, it was acceptance. Mary Ford took a breath. "Now it goes through the system," she said. "Investigators will review everything." She looked at her mother and sister one last time. "I didn't want this," she added quietly. "But I can't live inside a lie anymore." That sentence settled over the room like final closure. Even the guests seemed to understand that nothing said next would change what had already been exposed. Elizabeth Ford suddenly stood again, but this time there was no anger in her voice, only desperation. "We can fix this privately," she said quickly. "We can return the money." But Mary Ford shook her head. "It's already documented," she replied. "It's not just about money anymore." Paul finally lowered his head completely, silent. Mabel Ford looked at Williams Coltrane, her voice breaking. "Please, Dad," she whispered. But he didn't answer her. Instead, he looked at Mary Ford, and for the first time, his expression softened with regret. The silence that followed was long and unbearable. Williams Coltrane slowly stood again, this time more firmly. "This dinner is over," he said quietly. No one argued. No one moved. Elizabeth Ford sat back down slowly, defeated. Mabel Ford covered her face with her hands. Paul stared at the table, completely still. Mary Ford gathered her folder, her movements calm and controlled. She wasn't angry anymore, just finished. As she turned toward the door, the weight she had carried for years felt slightly lighter, even if nothing about the situation was truly resolved yet. Outside, the night air was cool and silent as Mary Ford stepped away from the house. Behind her, the light from the dining room still glowed, but it no longer felt like warmth. It felt like consequence. Williams Coltrane remained inside, sitting quietly at the table, finally seeing the full truth he had been kept away from. Mabel Ford, Elizabeth Ford, and Paul faced the reality they could no longer explain away. Mary Ford didn't look back. For the first time in years, she wasn't surviving someone else's story. She was finally walking out of it. If this story hit something deep in you, don't ignore that feeling. Not every betrayal is loud. Some happen quietly, through trust, through family, and through the people who were supposed to protect you. Mary Ford's story is a reminder that silence is not the same as peace, and that truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how long it takes. If you know someone who's always the strong one, the one nobody checks on, share this with them. It might be exactly what they need to hear. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment, like, and subscribe for more powerful revenge folktales and emotional true life-inspired stories. And remember, sometimes the hardest thing isn't walking away, it's finally choosing to see clearly.